Good evening, everyone. I'm Lauren Henry. I am Assistant Vice President of Alumni and Volunteer Experience at the university and also a proud alum of the university. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program. All of us are part of a bold and curious community united by a love of big ideas and tough questions. A community that is forever transformed by your interactions with the University of Chicago. A community that engages across generations and around the world to debate, discover, and learn. And every member of the University of Chicago community is a curious thinker and a student for life. And I know that that shared commitment to the life of the mind is what brought you here tonight. So before we get started, I want to share just a few highlights from campus. Just that illustrate the power of the university and the community that we are a part of. This year, more than 21,000 students applied to the college, the most ever, and our PhD program saw a 26% increase in applicants. We had 22 students receive Fulbright Awards this fall, and college student Tori Harris was named a Rhodes Scholar. We continue to see our faculty reach new and exciting heights, with 4 members recently receiving Guggenheim Fellowships and 8 earning Sloan Research Fellowships. Earlier this month, the university announced a $50 million gift to advance research and support for AI. And in February, a $20 million investment was made to the Harris School of Public Policy to advance the field of algorithmic public policy. So I hope that gives you a bit of a look at what an exciting time it is to be part of the University of Chicago. And I also hope that you're really excited to be here with us tonight for a conversation about the evolving mechanics of American government. And in the tradition of rigorous inquiry that defines the university, we've brought together experts from across the university to lead the conversation. So I'm going to properly read their bios so I do them justice. Ruth Bloch Rubin is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science, where she studies the U.S. Congress, political parties, and American political history. She is the author of 2 books about legislative power dynamics, Building the Bloc and Divided Parties, Strong Leaders, which I think you can see right up there. Bridget Fahey is a 2008 graduate of the college and a professor at the law school, in addition to being an affiliated scholar at the university's Data Science Institute, where she coordinates the Data Ecology Research Initiative. She is an expert in constitutional law and the law of data. Her work on federalism documents and theorizes the unexpected ways the federal government and states interact and the unorthodox legal tools they use to structure their joint projects. And moderating this evening's discussion is Ethan Bueno de Mesquita, another graduate of the college, and Dean and Sidney Stein Professor at the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy. He is a leading political scientist whose research applies game theoretic models to the study of conflict, political violence, national security, and electoral politics, and he has written extensively on methodological issues and social sciences. So with that, please join me in welcoming our incredible panel to the stage.
Hi, all right, great to be here. Thank you all for coming. Not all the news is good for all the people all the time, but right now, checks and balances and separation of powers are in the news, and if you're a law professor or a political scientist, that's like a rare opportunity where people want to hear from you. So it's exciting for us that you've all come to hear us talk about the ins and outs of the functioning of American democracy. So we're going to get started. So, we have a kind of a middle school civics version of the idea of checks and balances in Madisonian government involving 3 branches of government. But American democracy is, I think, that there's not nothing to middle school civics, but there's not everything to it either. American democracy is more complicated than that, and the sort of opportunities for checks and balances in our system runs more broadly than just those 3 branches. We talk about bureaucracy, we talk about federalism, we talk about all manner of things. So I'm interested, and there's ebb and flow over time to what the checks and balances systems look like. So I think maybe just to get us started, I'd be interested to hear from both of you from the perspective of your scholarship and your 2 disciplines. How do you think about where's the real nexus of checks and balances in American democracy today? How does that differ from our past, and sort of how do we get here? You want to start, Bridget?
I can start. So, of course, the first thing I would say in answer to your question is the states, because I study federalism, and we always see what we study wherever we look. But I think that these days, anyone reading a newspaper of record, I hope, is also seeing the actions of states and of cities in performing a really profound constitutional function. Now, the federalism of the modern moment is different than the federalism of past moments. The conventional way we think about federalism is as a system of divided power in which the jurisdiction of government generally is distributed between the federal government and the states. The federal government does national security, it does immigration, it does interstate commerce. States do local issues, they hold the police power, they're in charge of health and wellness. That's the conventional story. But in the contemporary world, most governing happens jointly in what in my scholarship I call shared regulatory spaces, or a model of cooperative federalism. So Clean Air Act is an enormous joint regulatory project. Medicaid is a sweeping joint regulatory project. But so is national security, so is immigration enforcement. So no matter where you look, you'll see involvement from cities, states, and the federal government. But that also changes the picture for checks and balances, because it means that cities and states have an important path of influence to exert from within collaborative initiatives or shared regulatory spaces. Sometimes they're not always collaborative, as we've, of course, been observing. That role in co-administering so many programs gives cities and states a kind of, we might call them the line-level bureaucrats of these programs. They are the officers and officials who interact with the public, who are responsible for a wide range of discretionary policy choices, who spend money on the line level. And that's one of the places where they exert checks against the federal government. We can get into how that's operating and how it's breaking down at times, but that's where we see the central use of their power. And I think the place where we most see it is in litigation. The lawsuits that the states have been filing, and a block of 26 states have been filing lawsuits against the federal government on almost a weekly basis over the course of the last year. Those lawsuits all stem from the state's role inside cooperative programs. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Ruth.
So if we, what Bridget's describing, I think, like in an intro to American politics class, we'd think of as like vertical separation of powers between the federal government and the states, but we can also think about separated institutions sharing power within the federal government, horizontal separation of powers. And so if we think about just the federal institutions of government, the executive branch, the judiciary, the legislative branch, what we're really thinking about formally are these different institutions with different constitutional mandates. And often that requires collaboration. And once you need collaboration, it requires coordination. And so the need to cooperate builds in opportunities to balance or check what the other branch is doing. And so these are sort of the formal design choices that we think provide a potential for checking and balancing. There are also sort of informal means which sort of potentially reinforce or perhaps mediate the effect of these design choices. So one place that we might look is thinking about the role that political parties play. So sometimes we think about political parties, imagine a Democratic Congress and a Republican president. The partisan interests of both sort of layered atop the two branches is going to create or deepen the divide between the two institutions, and is going to provide a sort of amped up check on what any one institution is going to be able to do. Many people worry that when you have one party in control of all of the branches, that will undermine the checks and balances we would expect to see, because partisan sympathies, whether that's shared ideology or a desire for your side to do well, that's going to sort of limit the effect of those structural checks and balances we have in place. As someone who studies intra-party politics, I would say we should be more cautious of thinking that parties are ultimately going to be a rubber stamp for a co-partisan. If you look at Republicans in Congress right now, they're fighting a lot over what to do with the president's agenda, how much of it to support, how far to push. And so we might think that parties themselves can provide an additional check even under periods where everybody, all of the institutions are nominally controlled by the same party, because factionalism is also an additional check on our sort of large polity, which is precisely what the framers imagined, which was build a large republic such that people would have competing factional interests that would make it hard to move American government too quickly in any one direction.
All right, so I want to come back to federalism for a moment, and I want to come to lawsuits and the CASA decision and universal injunctions in a little bit. But I want to start at something you said that I think is pretty provocative and interesting. So we have this idea, I guess, again, from civics, that there's these enumerated rights for the federal government, and there's things left to the states and local governments, and that's kind of where this vertical separation comes from. But you make this interesting argument. There's also kind of a capacity constraint for the federal government. They don't have all the information that the states and local governments, who are much closer to the people, do. And they, for certain kinds of enforcement actions and the like, they lack the person power. They lack the resources to get things done. There's an order of magnitude more local law enforcement than federal law enforcement and the like. So I think this takes us to like some things we've seen very recently that are interesting to think through, where we have seen the states and localities pushing back on the federal government and federal powers. I think you think of current actions, discussing sort of immigration enforcement, but older things like states who aren't aligned in a partisan way, turning down money, federal grants for programs they don't approve of, and the like. So I'm just interested to, like, how is it playing out that sort of on this kind of, not on the just formal separation, but like really on these, the federal government needs the states. How are the states leveraging their power, and what does that look like?
Yeah. So earlier this week, I taught one of the most important cases in structural constitutional law. I'm teaching 1L's structural constitutional law right now, which is amazing intellectual experience for 1Ls under all circumstances, but is a particularly interesting experience right now because structural constitutional law is changing every day, and new profound questions of structural constitutional law keep arising. But I was teaching this case, Youngstown, which involves the President Truman's seizure of steel mills during the Korean War. And in his really famous concurrence in the case, Robert Jackson says, we divide power, the Constitution is a strategy of dividing power between the federal government and the states, but it also contemplates that power will be reunited for workable government. So the important question, the provocative question is, how does it become reunited? What are the rules of engagement between the federal government and the states? One of the things that I write about is the effectively contract-like nature of that relationship. And if you look at the lawsuits that the states have filed against the federal government, they actually look a lot like ordinary contract lawsuits. They say, when we agreed to assist you with certain aspects of federal immigration enforcement, we specifically withheld a commitment to other federal immigration enforcement objectives. We said, we'll help enforce federal immigration law for one category of offenders, but not another category of offenders. Or we will turn over certain limited data to the federal government, but withhold other data from the federal government. We'll let you use some of our state and local sites, but not others. And sometimes cities and states said, we don't want to provide any support, and that is their prerogative. But then the federal government effectively breached its promises, its end of the bargain, and the states said, you can't breach. So that contract-like frame is a very different kind of lawsuit than we would, just reading the text of the Constitution, think would be a source of power for states and a kind of axes of check against the federal government. So some of this is playing out in kind of ordinary contract actions, and some of those are happening in a court very few people have heard of called the Court of Claims, which is the federal court that hears contract lawsuits. So a lot of constitutional law is happening right now in this little court of claims in Washington, D.C. And I think that's very favorable because I think contract law is actually quite protective of state interests. It actually makes it difficult for the federal government to change its mind on a dime, to extract additional support or money or engagement or capacity from states that states have not voluntarily agreed to give. And there are a set of important constitutional doctrines that backstop these relationships. The most important one is called the anti-commandeering rule, which everybody in middle school civics learns, for example, Congress has the power of the purse. One of my missions is to make it so that everybody's heard that Congress has the power of the purse, and everybody's heard that the states are protected by the anti-commandeering rule, because the anti-commandeering rule says that if the federal government wants state governments to be involved in federal projects, it has to bargain for that involvement voluntarily. The federal government can regulate individuals directly, as can states, but if the federal government wants assistance of state police officers, if it wants investment of state money, if it wants states to pass laws in the service of federal programs, it's got to ask for it and negotiate for it, and it's got to give states something. And what we're seeing right now is states being sharp-elbowed negotiators, and we're also seeing states standing on their rights. So I think there is a kind of somewhat at least optimistic story about how states have learned to maneuver in the context of these joint programs, and I hope that we see more of that.
I happen to be running a middle school as a side gig at the moment, so maybe we can pair up. Okay, so Ruth, you pointed us, at least subtly, towards the Federalist Papers and in your discussion of sort of the large and plural republic. I want to think about another bit of that kind of argument that the founders were making. I think there's the founders were very concerned with creating an energetic executive. And, I think there's an argument, if one wanted to make such an argument, that like one of the sort of original sins of the Constitution was that the founders, or at least the authors of the Federalist Papers, could not imagine the possibility that the legislative branch would not be preeminent. But certainly in post-Reconstruction America, we have seen, at least cyclically, emergence of the energetic executive and the Newstad's phrase of the imperial presidency. And I think we are, maybe, I don't know, you tell me, but like post 9/11 to now, seen a period of extraordinary growth of executive power. Not the first time. We saw it during Johnson and Nixon. We saw it during FDR. And a sort of somnolent Congress. So I'm interested, one, is that's the story I think we all have in our heads. Is it right? What's going on? And at least, sort of post-Watergate, we saw Congress emerge and pass a series of really extraordinary legislation to try and claw back power. I'm interested in whether it worked. And I'm also interested in, could we imagine a resurgent Congress? And if so, in the modern era, would that look like post-Watergate Congress? What would it have to look like for Congress to reassert legislative authority?
It is truly hard, looking back now, to imagine, as the Federalists did, that Congress would be king. But as you say, that is what they were imagining. And so if we think about pathologies of an institution, it may be fair to say that a lot of the challenges to seeing the legislature take a more assertive role today is a function of trying to bake into the legislative cake, if you will, even more checks and balances than the ones we were talking about. The fact that we have a House and a Senate, we introduce bicameralism, that complicates things. We have different representative structures between the House and the Senate. Again, that complicates coordination. So it's helpful, I think, to start with the premise that, as wildly inconceivable as it is today, they were really worried about Congress becoming overly powerful. And so they built in certain structural features to that institution and paid less attention to the kinds of things you might put into the executive branch if you were worried about a president becoming something closer to a monarch. Fast forward to now, and those concerns maybe seem more pressing. And so I think one thing to think about is what we ask of the different branches of government. And I think one of the things that political scientists have pointed to is that over time, the public has expected the federal government to deliver more, to provide and implement more policies, to solve more of the public's problems. And the institution that has sought to sort of represent those national concerns is typically the president. And so the president is in a position where they are trying to leverage the institutional sources of power at their disposal to deliver what, in order to win a national election, they have promised either explicitly or implicitly to the public. Lawmakers, because they represent a much smaller geography, have made somewhat smaller claims. And so they, you might say, have less of an incentive to try and accumulate more power within the legislature itself in order to deliver on those same problems. So we have an incentive problem to begin with. Presidents are looking to do big things, and lawmakers are torn between an interest in protecting their institution, ensuring that Congress maybe can revert back to being king, and also very parochial concerns. And so when you're cross-pressured, as we all know in our regular lives, right, we don't do any of those things all that well. And so maybe one diagnosis in thinking about what we might think of as legislative inertia or disinterest in limiting presidential power is a function of these sort of torn incentives. We also worry, and think a lot about the difficulty of knowing when Congress can't do something and won't do something. And so we hear a lot about lawmakers, and they're very often very vocal about discomfort with the executive branch and how it has grown. This is not simply about presidential power, but about the power of executive branch agencies. And so there's concern, right, that they're unable as members of Congress to understand all of the things that are happening within the executive branch. And so you might think that this would be impetus to try and increase oversight. And so we do see over the course of congressional history a sort of rise of concern over being able to monitor what the executive branch is doing. Sometimes that's about presidential behavior, sometimes that's about bureaucratic behavior, and sort of efforts to re-energize the key modes of congressional oversight, which typically happen through congressional committees. If we're thinking about what's going on in Congress today, we're in this unfortunate low point because I think, in part, congressional committees themselves have been hollowed out because of a bunch of partisan politics, which we can talk about at some point if that's of interest. But it has meant that the sort of key organizational forces that harness legislative preferences and interest in overseeing the executive branch are limited in their ability to do so because congressional committees themselves are not the core source of power within the legislature. And so we have presidential incentives to do as much as they can with as much power as they have, and lawmakers without a sort of core directional force to allow them to push back on presidents.
Does the death of the committee, does that represent, the Watergate reforms were in part supposed to re-empower the committee system, and they seemed, either presidents ran circles around Congress or there was a mistake in the design of the post-Watergate reform. What happened to the committee system?
So it's interesting because so the Watergate reforms were primarily interested in increasing oversight capacity for Congress. But the Watergate reforms that took place in the 1974 era followed shortly reforms that took place first within the party caucuses, but then were structurally imposed on Congress, which changed how the committee system operated. So the congressional committee system of the 1950s and 1960s had very strong committee leaders. And because of changes within the Democratic Party and a desire to see those committee leaders relinquish power, the sort of core committee barons had to devolve a lot of authority to subcommittees. So if you're thinking along about collective action problems, suddenly you have a whole bunch of subcommittees that are in charge of coordinating with each other. And you also have a bunch of reforms that were passed at the time, which, in addition to taking power away from committee leaders, gave it to party leaders instead. And so if we think about who's incentivized to investigate the president, you might think that congressional party leaders, if they're of the same party as the president and might themselves have political ambitions or long-term relationships with presidents or vice presidents, might be less interested in using their authority. And so yes, we have the Watergate reforms, which could have potentially increased the power of committees, but they were layered atop of these other reforms that carved out a lot of the committee's authority.
Can I add?
Yeah, go.
Can I add one quick thing, which is I think that the Supreme Court is also responsible for the situation we observe in the federal government because, and this is simplifying a little bit, but I think it's true that the court takes a very formalist and narrow view of Congress's authority and an expansive and functionalist view of the president's authority. So if you read opinions, for example, Trump versus United States, the opinion about whether a former president can be criminally prosecuted, there is no originalism to be found in that opinion. There is no textualism to be found in that opinion. It's an opinion rooted in the characteristics and personality of the executive branch that the court believes the Constitution creates. The energetic executive that can act with dispatch. They're returning to these little quotable quotes from the Federalist Papers. But when the court approaches congressional power, for example, in an important case called INS versus Chadha, which says that Congress can't structure programs to exert oversight over administrative agencies by exerting what they called a legislative veto, which disempowered houses of Congress. They use this very fastidious textualist reasoning about how congressional action has to specifically go through bicameralism and presentment each and every time. So I think we see an interpretive asymmetry in the way the Supreme Court has thought about congressional power relative to executive power, which has expanded the executive and contracted the legislature.
It's also interesting because as I've understood it, there's also inconsistencies as how the Supreme Court thinks about Congress's role. Because sometimes the court says this is a political question and it should be decided by a political branch. And indeed, the most representative branch is Congress. So this is Congress's choice. But then it ignores the realities of the difficulties of legislating and mustering, a majority coalition or a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate, and assumes that inaction is a sign of people's preferences rather than the sort of structural barriers that, if it's attentive to other structural designs, it might, behoove it to pay attention to.
Yeah, and now that you say that, I think there's probably a paper to be written about this, but. If you look at how the Supreme Court characterizes the representative quality of the presidency and Congress, you're right that they use just interchangeable, like sometimes the executive is the most democratic branch. So in a really important case from 2020 called Sela Law, which held that the president has to be able to remove officers of the United States at will for any reason. This is really important because, as I'm sure everybody in the room knows, the president would very much like to fire Jerome Powell. And that will have serious economic consequences. And what is protecting Powell from being fired is probably those economic consequences, but also the statute that protects him from being fired without cause. So the constitutionality of that statute is very vulnerable right now. And in that case, the court describes the presidency as the most democratic, most accountable branch. We divide power everywhere else, the Chief Justice tells us, but the strategy of the Constitution is to concentrate power in the president because the president is so very accountable to the people. So I think there are deep inconsistencies in the Supreme Court's theory of the comparative representative character of the branches.
Let's stick with the courts then for a minute. So the courts are in this interesting position. They are, I think, in a world of sort of quiescent Congress, the courts are in some ways trying to step into the breach also. Like in some ways they're responsible, and in some ways they see themselves as the only branch sort of available to balance the executive. And we've had in recent years kind of a big debate about the role of the courts there and what level of the federal judiciary should be doing this. So we had this big decision, the CASA decision that happened on the shadow docket about the question of whether district courts, the sort of federalism of the federal courts, those sort of local federal courts, could make rulings that made executive actions disallowed for the whole country. And the courts had been doing this, and so the federal government kind of had to run the table, win every trial, and lots of presidents from both parties were frustrated with this because the low-level courts could block federal agendas. The Supreme Court pulled back that power, and I'm interested to think about both maybe a little bit on what exactly happened, why they did it, and also how we might think about that in terms of the Supreme Court thinking about its own role versus the role of the federal judiciary writ large in this competition it's having with the executive branch, with Congress having absented itself a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a view that it was too easy to what we would call in civil procedure forum shop, to just, if you're a red state and you dislike the actions of the Obama administration or the Biden administration, then you hustle over to the Northern District of Texas, which has one judge, the Amarillo District, which has one judge and is a Republican appointee and is known for being very favorable to the claims of red states against blue presidents. If you are blue states during a Trump presidency, then you hustle over to the District of Rhode Island, which has all Democratic appointees and are known for being very friendly to the views of blue states against red presidents. And it just created conditions in which, it's actually interesting to think about from a checks perspective, because this is a pretty sweeping check. And you could say this maybe pulls back in some of the friction into the executive that we have lost by so strengthening the executive. So in that sense, I think it would be fair to think about this nationwide injunction power as being useful in the sense that it can slow down executive action. It can stop that action for the pendency of litigation. On the other hand, it is a lot of power for a single district court judge. So, on our faculty at the law school, we have the nation's expert in nationwide injunctions in Sam Bray, who has written about them extensively and the theories of equity that the injunction power embodies. So you can read Sam's work, and it is worth it because it's really good and really, really thoughtful on these questions. I think as Ethan, you rightly observed, what the Supreme Court did when it eliminated the nationwide injunction is empowered itself. And you can see that as being itself an important check against increasingly muscular executive branch. The plot thickens, though, a little bit, because the way the Supreme Court has been superintending the injunction power is to do it almost entirely on, as you say, the shadow docket. The shadow docket are the cases that the Supreme Court has not granted certiorari in. They're not the 90 cases a year that are going to receive full briefing and oral argument. They're cases in which typically a motion comes to a single justice. That justice refers the motion to the court, and it's decided on the papers. That is generally without oral argument. And it's not a very deliberative form of judicial reasoning, and very often in the last year, the Supreme Court makes decisions and provides no reasons. And that creates its own kind of chaos. So it is a nice potential thought to try to centralize this power in the highest level of the judiciary rather than at the periphery in one of the hundreds of district court judges around the country. On the other hand, the Supreme Court is a relatively small institution. It's 9 justices. They hear a lot of cases. They're very involved and very complex, and these days extremely high stakes. And they're also now in a position of having to quickly hear appeals from injunctions issued by district court judges because the parties want them to become nationwide. And the effectively only way to do that is to quickly appeal them to the Supreme Court. And I think it's clear that the Supreme Court's time capacity and personnel capacity is not entirely up to the task. But I'm also not sure that the court has the capacity in its kind of legitimacy budget to be so deeply involved in so many cases that can't go through the court's thorough deliberative processes. And you see really a lot of contestation about this between Supreme Court justices in the open right now.
It is worth noting, I think, relative to our conversation about Congress, Congress could solve this problem for the courts. Congress is empowered to create new Article III courts. It could solve this problem by creating some judicial capacity to do exactly this work if it wanted. I'm going to ask one last question because I don't want to fail to talk about political parties. Political parties right now get a little bit of a bad rap, that they're responsible for a lot of the problems in American democracy and in the interbranch relationships. It used to be that political parties played a really central role, I think, in the institutions being able to assert themselves and helping to organize, especially Congress, to assert itself as an independent branch. How should we think about changes in American partisanship and the role parties are playing now or could play and change?
Yeah, I mean, parties in a legislative context, let's cabin our conversation to that. Right, if you think about it, the workaday job of lawmaking requires getting a certain number of votes, and political parties make that efficient. If you have a vote that Democrats are going to want, you find all the people with D's next to their name, and you say, show up here and vote for this thing. And so you as an individual member don't have to pay as much attention. The party itself can guide a policy agenda through the bicameral process, send it to the executive, and you move on, and you cover a lot of ground that way. The parties themselves have reorganized themselves a bunch over the course of American history, and at every point have kind of figured it out and managed to come back to this sort of coordinative capacity. A wrinkle about our current moment that I think is really important to underscore is that the degree to which a majority controls a legislative chamber has shrunk because the number of members that constitute that majority has shrunk. So if you're paying attention to what's happening in Congress right now, you know that Mike Johnson has the slimmest of Republican majorities. And so that means he has to get everybody to agree. So it's not necessarily that parties' coordinative capacity has changed, the sort of underlying organizational mechanism, but you got to get everybody to agree in a way that you didn't have to in the 1950s or 1960s or 1980s, where a small majority was considered 40 plus, right? Tip O'Neill would complain about having to get 40 members on board. That was, his margin of error, whereas Mike Johnson is worried about every last person. And so I think parties come in for a lot of blame, deservedly so, but a feature, I think, of our politics right now is that as a country, we are deeply and narrowly divided, and that is a difficult combination. We can be deeply divided, but have a large majority, or we can be have just like little valleys, right? But you can have people working across the aisle, but when you have people who are deeply opposed and you need every last member, it gets to be really difficult to legislate at all.
All right, I think we are going to open it up for questions. There's mics, and I think people will come around, so you can just raise your hand and somebody will find you.
That was fast. Whoa. Hi, I'm Julie Norris. Do we live in a plutocracy? Is the United States now a plutocracy?
Yeah.
And how do we solve that?
I mean, I guess what I would say is that it depends on what what previous eras in American politics were. I think if you look back at the 1800s, the individuals who were leading the country were also among the wealthy, educated elite. So in that way, our top echelon has diversified on a bunch of dimensions, and it is more apparent that there are inequalities. But I don't know, maybe American government and probably all governments tend to privilege the interests of the people with existing power who then work the institutions of government to keep that power. Whether you think of power as resources, money, land, right? Like that's typically how the system works until there's a revolution, right? And so we're just trying to avoid, the worst case outcome, I think.
Yeah, and I do think when we talk about the government, we have to be talking about our city governments, our state governments, our county governments, and the federal government. And I think the contours of government and its characteristics and its frictions look different when you think of the government generally, rather than just the federal government. And I should have said, because sometimes these days it can be nice to have even a little small optimistic note. I do think that our system of federalism is working as it was designed to work. I don't think that's true of our system of separated powers within the federal government, but federalism guarantees that there's going to be 25 or 26 states that are on the opposite side of the federal government, and that's to the good. And I support that even when, I won't share my own personal politics, but I support that whether the people I like are in control of the federal government or not, because I think that is part of the design of our system. It forces deliberation, it allows pluralism, it creates negotiation and compromise. It's always, always, always messy though. So it's not as easy to see it as it doesn't look like a functioning government, but I think the design of the government is that it look a little dysfunctional, and that's how we know it's working. But I think the states are preventing the worst forms of concentrated power. And I do get heartburn about the increasingly concentrated power within the federal government, but the states are succeeding in lots of ways in dispersing that power, even if they're not succeeding in every case.
I think it's also important to note, I guess two things. One is, it is harder than one might think from the discourse to find really strong evidence of the effects of money on electoral outcomes. Now, that's in part because we live in a democracy where almost every congressional district is safe, and so it is simply hard to lose an election if you're from the right party, and primaries are playing more of a role than they used to. But it's harder than you'd think to find like really big distortions to policy, at least in the data. And I think it's also important to think about how important the electoral part of electoral democracy is, and relative to the point about federalism, how well in lots of ways, although this state could count its votes faster, electoral administration works in the United States.
Marietta Jason. Some time ago, I was at a lecture, and the person suggested that at the time, in the Federalist paper, it was suggested that the founding fathers believed that there would be many more parties than there are now, and we wouldn't be in the grip of the administration right now. My question is, why, if that were so, there were multiple parties, let's say, how would that have changed? How would that change things from now?
I'm going to have a very unsatisfying answer for you, which is, I'll start by noting, I think the Federalists are really complicated, so they use the term factions, but they don't really tell us what that is. And so maybe they're thinking about multiple parties, maybe they're just talking about loosely organized interests. George Washington was famously opposed to parties altogether, so the Founding Fathers are kind of inconsistent on parties in general. Disliking parties has a long legacy in American politics. The challenge I think we have when we are thinking about whether, if a third party were to emerge today, would that change politics substantially? Is that if we, this is a little bit uncomfortable for me because I study American politics and I do not study other countries, but from what I've read, right, a lot of the challenges that we can point to in American politics are also present in other countries with multi-party systems. And so if you were, say, worried about the rise of populism and you thought, well, if we have a multi-party system, we're gonna have ways to diffuse that, you can look to plenty of European countries or Latin American countries and say, well, I don't know, it doesn't look so much better. We also, if you think about the challenge of sort of adding new features onto American politics is that they're going to get layered on top of existing features. So if you think it's hard to build a coalition in Congress today, if you layer on multiple parties, you might worry that it will get even more difficult. And as proof of concept for that, I would feature any of our current major political parties. And if you think about each of those factions, progressives, members of the House Freedom Caucus has their own political parties, and you think about how easily they've managed to get along with each other, it might lead you to be cautious that layering on that additional reform would improve our situation overmuch.
Thank you so much. This has been really fascinating. I'm Caleb, 2022 econ and math alum. I have a lot of questions, but I'll pick one, which is at the beginning of this current administration, I think one of the notable things from my perspective that happened was the firing of a lot of inspectors general. I'm curious how that plays into the oversight role of Congress over the federal government, or the executive branch, I should say.
It doesn't help. I mean, Congress has so many problems. We could be here all day. I mean, one of the challenges is that Congress relies on input from inspectors general to investigate questions, potential problems, potential instances of malfeasance, misbehavior, because lawmakers themselves are doing 99 other things. And so they're really relying on the expertise of these independent sort of detectives, if you will, to do this work. And so when you don't have people who are nominally independent, or indeed, in fact, independent, then as an institution, you're losing out on the informational capacity, the actual enforcement or investigative capacity, and you're then reliant on your own staff to do this additional oversight work. And if you know anyone who has worked on Capitol Hill, the most common refrain is there's not enough staff to do anything well. And so this is, again, I think, a problem for Congress, and one it could identify statutory solutions for in improving its own capacity, but as we know, getting things done is itself difficult.
Yeah, I think, Congress, one of the other things that I study is how information moves around the government and the kind of power, the structural constitutional law of information and of data. And, I think just to Ruth's point, I think there are ways that Congress could kind of join the digital age in enhancing its own informational capacity rather than relying as a kind of throughput on officers that are, because of the Constitution's implied removal power, under the control of the president. So there are statutory solutions, and there's kind of good governance innovation to be had in helping to rebalance the informational power within the federal government so that Congress has its own independent sources of information.
There's historical precedent for exactly that. I mean, in a previous era of imperial presidency after the New Deal and sort of soaring expansion of federal involvement in Americans' lives, Congress became aware that the executive branch was running circles around it. And under the leadership of Lyndon Johnson, before he became president, when he was a congressional leader, that is where we got the idea of congressional staff and made a huge investment in Congress's ability to staff up and check the executive. And one could imagine, a digital investment along the lines of Johnson's investment in staff that might make a real difference for Congress.
Hi there. Thank you again for the talk. I'm Mason. I graduated in 2022, molecular engineering. So I have a question around the balance between regulation and legislation. So what do you think the future of the administrative state will look like if the court embraces kind of a more robust view of the non-delegation doctrine that sort of says that Congress can't hand off its lawmaking power to executive agencies? Thanks.
Yeah, so the court has already dabbled in this, as probably many people read earlier this year in a case called Learning Resources. There is a kind of sub-part of the non-delegation doctrine called the Major Questions Doctrine, which is an interpretive canon. It's a canon that counsels that when a statute seems to give the president or the administrative state substantial power that the drafters of the statute likely didn't contemplate, that interpretation should be avoided. There are some justices that think it's not just an interpretive canon, but a kind of constitutional requirement. But it is designed to kind of limit delegations from Congress to the presidency. Now, a lot of law is made inside the federal government because of very outdated statutes that are not updated. So, the Obama administration passed intricate set of rules regarding climate change pursuant to a statute that was quite old and wasn't thinking in terms of climate change, at least that kind of terminology. The statute that gave rise to the Major Questions decision was a statute that gives the president a portfolio of emergency economic powers, but doesn't mention tariffs specifically, though it does mention 7 or 8 other mechanisms. And the court said to interpret, some of them are very broad, but says to interpret these other categories to allow tariffs would be the kind of delegation, to assume by implication the kind of delegation of power that we would have expected Congress to make directly. I think it's very interesting. I always, when I teach students, constitutional law tells them it's hard to gerrymander constitutional law to your political preferences. The major questions doctrine, the non-delegation doctrine, they were kind of invented by the right, by the conservative members of the court, not invented. Other countries have these same kind of doctrines. It's called the doctrine of legality in many parliamentary systems that is a protection for the role of parliament. But it was kind of devised and pressed by the right. I think it could be the kind of thing that plays a significant role in re-empowering Congress and in making Congress restructuring the incentives that Ruth was describing. Now, Congress has to be responsible for problems that arise because the president can say, I simply can't do that. I do not have the power within this statute. So I think the political valence of some of these doctrines could shift. So it is at least worth taking them on their kind of merits. I could say as a predictive judgment that we're going to see a more muscular non-delegation doctrine arise. I think it's in the interest of the kind of ideologically right members of the court to have a set of doctrines that do constrain executive power, because they are thinking about their own legitimacy also, and they can't be seen to be siding with the executive on everything. But there are some important points where ideologically I think they are very aligned with a more muscular executive. So this is one of the areas where I think they can side with Congress, as it were. So predictably, I think they're likely to. I'm sort of open to. I'm happy to talk about the non-delegation doctrine and major questions doctrine. I think they're really interesting. Legal theories.
I was just going to say, like, on this point, like, practically speaking, this means that you're going to have to write much more detailed legislation. And so that's going to make it harder in expectation to pass legislation because there's no ambiguity. Ambiguity is a blessing when legislating because people can read into it what they want and you can build a majority on that basis. But if you have to be really careful, not only does it require a lot of capacity and staff work, but it also requires making sure that you've written it in just such a way that it says what it needs to say, but also is able to maintain a coalition. Now, maybe that's a good thing, right? Like, Congress should write good laws, and we have already problems where members aren't digesting and reading and claiming to understand what is in the legislation they're signing into law. To Bridget's point, I think, one interesting thing about this is that when you have to some folks have argued that, right, like the challenge then is for progressives, for Democrats, for folks who want government to do stuff, because now you have to write what that stuff is into law. But I think if we look at changes that have occurred across both parties, we see both parties with what we would call sort of a positive legislative agenda. They want things. They want government to do things. They don't agree on what government should do, but they both want government to do things. And so this is, again, something that should affect both parties equally. If you want to change immigration policy, well, you've got to write an immigration bill that's going to pass the House and Senate. And all those details, all those I's and T's have to be dotted and crossed. And that's going to be really difficult.
All right, I'm feeling judged by the red light on the clock, so we're going to ask Lauren to come up and close us out.
Thank you so much, and I am all that stands between you all and dessert and further conversation, so I'm going to keep it quick. Mostly first to thank our incredible panel. Please join me in thanking them for such a fascinating conversation. And I also just want to offer many thanks to all of you for being here tonight, for your insightful questions. It's a University of Chicago audience. I would expect nothing less. I definitely saw hands that did not get called on. So that's what dessert is for. But I also I want to thank you for staying connected to our incredible university. By maintaining that connection, by carrying the university with you wherever you go, you are enabling us to embody the definition of a global community. So when you wear a sweatshirt, when you read a magazine, when you talk about the things that you hear, when you come to events like this tonight, you bring the university to life for students, for alumni, for friends, for your communities. And I just want to express such deep gratitude for that. So thank you so much for being here. Please keep the dialogue going at the closing reception, and we'll look forward to seeing you all again soon. Good night.